Welcome to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Jessica Birch, a national advocate and speaker living on the southeast coast of Australia. Since her late diagnosis of Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, or FASD, at the age of 33, she has turned her attention to awareness building and education to create a better understanding of the prevalence and consequences of prenatal alcohol exposure in Australia. Jessica shares her lived experience in an effort to arm individuals, parents and carers, educators, and health professionals with the information they need to create successful interventions and support. She believes awareness and action are key to minimizing the rate of prenatal alcohol exposure globally, and works closely with organizations, stakeholders, and government on alcohol policy and regulatory reform. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you today and learn more about your story and the type of advocacy for FASD that you do. So, would love to learn a little more about yourself and what it was like growing up. So, what was your experience like growing up with undiagnosed fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Of course, well, you know what, Carolyn, in a word, it was hard. It was very, very hard and lonely. And and this is really despite having a really like for all intents and purposes, having a beautiful childhood. I grew up in a very safe, supportive, loving, and structured environment. Yet there was this underlying sort of unexplained sadness that I carried through my childhood that in many ways, well, was very much sort of unexplained until it was explained. And and it hurts me a little bit whenever I say that I had a sad and sort of lonely childhood because within my family unit and particularly with mum, growing up with my mum and my younger brother, mum worked so hard to provide everything that we needed and provide just really beautiful, fun experiences when we were growing up. And we had so many beautiful experiences growing up, yet the this these difficulties and this sadness and sort of remained in me. And my mum really felt that and she knew and didn't know what to do about it. And I know that as I grew up, that was something that really broke her heart. That was a really hard time. But to sort of paint a little bit of a better picture of what sort of FASD looked like for me as a kid, I have significant issues with, and very typically of a FASD diagnosis, I have issues around my executive function, my adaptive function and affect regulation, which is my emotional regulation, my memory, my attention, learning, things with academia. I have quite significant sensory issues, sensory regulatory issues, issues with my proprioception, which is those sort of internal feelings of the body, and as well as damage to my nervous system. So if you break that down a bit, you think about all those higher order skills like initiating a task, setting a goal, knowing how to problem solve, flexible thinking, time management, planning, prioritizing, social interactions, social participation, understanding the social cues, being able to block out competing sounds, being able to learn through verbal instruction. The list goes on and on and on. And I was not only dealing with these sort of cognitive challenges and learning challenges as I developed throughout my childhood, but I was dealing with quite a lot of physical symptoms of my nervous system. So I had quite severe exercise intolerance, for example, because I had a really elevated heart rate. I had a lot of symptoms of presyncope, so or postural tachycardia. So when I was standing, I would often get symptoms of dizziness, nausea, that sort of thing. And as a 10-year-old, for example, you don't really, you think everybody's experiencing that. You think all of the kids having these same experiences, and you have no context. You have no way of sort of separating those feelings and that experience from what is happening for everyone else, and what is, as a child, what is normal and what is not. So I I went through my childhood and the schooling experience with many, many of these challenges. And as much as I was supported in my family unit, it really wreaked a lot of havoc. And I'll just say quickly, I don't want to talk and talk and talk at you, but I'll just say quickly that there was just it was obvious that there was a few quirks there, but I was a bright and engaged kid for the most part. I didn't present with these really extreme behaviors that, people sort of flag and then sort of go, oh, wait, there's a problem here. And because I have strong language skills, all these difficulties were hidden behind this smiling face and this little kid that was kind of willing to try and learn, but yeah, definitely sort of fell behind. And as demands increased, so too did the difficulties.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, as you said, you described really a wide variety of experiences and challenges that you had. And as I understand that, that can be very common for FASD, is that it's a kind of a range of physical and cognitive and I guess in some ways emotional, because you talk about being kind of very sad and depressed as a child. And, with a certain level of hiding it behind that, being very bright and great at language and smiling, that can make it hard, I guess, to really say that something definitive is wrong. And again, you say because you think everybody goes
Absolutely.
through it.
Absolutely. And, it's easy to fall through the cracks with that sort of presentation when people don't aren't looking through the brain lens.
Yeah.
If there's no awareness around what these brain-based behaviors look like, then it's really easy, if a child is not presenting with these really extreme sort of, yeah, again, behaviors, symptoms, outbursts, challenges,
Yeah.
for it to be missed or for it to be chalked up to other things. So, some of the issues, like, for example, some of the auditory processing things, mum realized quite early on, and I was getting sort of assessed for that. And there was a few other things as well. And what was always sort of brought back is that, oh, she's a smart kid, so everything's fine. And, everything is behavioral and she'll just grow out of it, which is kind of, is a bit ironic because it is behavioral and it is like, but you don't grow out of it. It changes and amalgamates, but the challenges are there and they do remain. So it was really difficult. It was a hard time. I was a child that I don't feel like I was particularly rebellious. My mum might have something else to say about it. But I was pretty under wraps. I was one of those kids that really wanted to do well in school and really wanted to please. I've always been a bit of a overachiever, let's just say that. And so I aligned myself in my childhood with the kids that, were achieving and were the brightest and the smartest in the class. And were excelling in different ways. And that's what I really wanted. And I wanted to be seen as the same. And from very early on, I inexplicably felt other. And there are a few reasons for that, but the biggest reason is that I had undiagnosed FASD and I was functioning in a different way to the other kids, and I didn't realize, and I was just desperately, desperately trying to fit in and fulfill this, I guess, this childhood vision of myself and the groups in the group of children that I thought that I should be a part of. And there was different difficulties that came through with that.
Mhm. So, how did you eventually realize that you had FASD? Like, how did you even learn about what FASD was?
Uh Again, I just have to praise my mum for this. This is quite I will try and give a shorter sort of abridged version because this was quite an ordeal, and it was a long battle, kind of 10 years in a lifetime sort of thing. I was finally diagnosed just before my 33rd birthday. I'm 38 years old now, so it's been nearly 6 years since my diagnosis. But the diagnosis, and I'll explain a little bit more deeply, but the diagnosis came 4 years after we realized that it's likely that I have FASD. So there was 4 years to obtain the diagnosis, but that realization of FASD came almost 10 years after a very lengthy health battle, both my physical and mental health. And I was really at a point where I was desperate for help, and I was desperate for change. It's a very dark time in my life. And so I had been basically from the time I left home, of course, transition from childhood to into adulthood for individuals with FASD can be very, very difficult. Just because of having all those sort of higher order, like adulting skills. Most of those skills in individuals with FASD are broken or they work intermittently. And so it's very difficult to navigate an adult life without support and guidance and help. And of course, I didn't want the help. I wanted to come out on my own, and I thought, that I was going to go and make something of myself, and, I was going to do it all on my own, and I didn't need my mother anymore. I was an adult and this and that, the other thing. And I'd had a very difficult time in high school. I wasn't a particularly happy chappy, but anyway, I went off, I did my life, I started my 20s and I left home and I traveled and got a job. And I started to find things progressively more and more difficult. And I had more and more sort of physical symptoms and significant issues with fatigue and brain fog and other things. So I started seeking help. I realized when I was about 22, something was quite wrong and that I wasn't managing very well. And I started seeking both general and specialized help. However, what happened for me is I got trapped in the mental health care system. And so, of course, I was very anxious. I was very depressed. I had dealt with years and years of difficulties and hidden years and years of difficulties. Very good masker. You learn how to mask when you're not diagnosed, and you become very, very, very good at it. So, yeah, a lot of the challenges were really underneath the surface. But my functioning for me in the world became harder and harder and harder and harder. And it got to this point where I was so ill. And I do have secondary diagnoses and secondary sort of disability. And my mother stepped in, basically. I I got to about maybe 26, 27. I had just finished school. I did go back to uni for 2 years, and that experience nearly killed me. And I don't mean that to say that to be melodramatic. It just the pressure and the the responsibility of trying to complete that, I I I hit my limit at that point. And I've essentially this was more than 10 years ago, and from that point, I was no longer able to work. I was basically bedridden, and my mum stepped in, and I was deeply depressed. And my mum stepped in and was like, "No, something is very wrong. Nothing that your doctors are saying is sort of answering what is going on here. We need help. This can't stand." And it was my mother who stepped in and supported my healthcare journey from that point on. And it took about, I think it took about 2 years. And we were looking at a lot of autoimmune. I was symptom like I had a lot of autoimmune symptoms. So we were looking for an autoimmune disorder. It didn't really address the cognitive issues that mum had seen throughout my life, but we didn't know what that was, and it didn't make sense in our awareness why that would be happening. Eventually, so after a couple of years, my mum happened to be watching a reporting TV show on in Australia. It's called Four Corners. I think there is an American version actually. And it happened to be an episode on FASD. And it was a mother and her children, and they were talking, they had their adult children, and they were talking about their experience of FASD. And my mum was watching it. I wasn't there. My mum was watching this, and she's like, "Oh my God, this is what's happening to my daughter. This is what it is. This is the problem." And so she started doing a ton of research and started to try and really connect the dots to look at the issues that I'd had throughout my life and the issues that I was having now, in at the time. And this was about 2016, 2017. And she started compiling all the information and trying to make the connections and sort of see, hey, this is what it's looking like. She spent time doing that, and then she came to me and she approached me about it. We don't live in the same state. I have to fly to my mum. I live in a city called Melbourne, and my mum's in Victoria, which is on the southeast coast, and my mum lives on the northeast coast. So when I went to visit my mother, she sat me down and she said, "Look, this is what I think the issue is. And this is why." But funnily enough, I always knew my birth story. So I always knew that I had been exposed to alcohol. And if anyone at any point, any doctor, any health professional from like the age of 10 had asked me, had I been exposed to alcohol when I was in mummy's tummy, for example, I would have been able to say yes. When I was a 16-year-old and I started visiting doctors on my own, had anyone asked me, I would have been able to say yes. It's just that no one asked and no one made the connection despite presenting with complex problems.
Mhm.
And so when my mum broached it with me, I rejected it outright. Absolutely rejected it. I said, "How could you possibly say this to me? How could it be that? You don't know. You don't know." I'm not listening to you. As you do,
Mhm.
as and I was so upset and I was so frustrated that she had put that forward as the solution, because my knowledge of what a brain injury looks like and what brain-based behavior looks like, but more, sorry, to be honest, more generally, what a brain damage looks like, I just thought that that meant that you weren't smart. That's what I thought. And I know that in instances, it can affect intellect, it can affect IQ, and that's very unfortunate, and it's very sad, and that's why I advocate as strongly as I do. But that's all I thought that it meant. And I and I have regrets about not having
Mhm.
that knowledge, but that's what I thought my mum was telling me.
Oh.
And I rejected it. It hurt what I had hoped was my view of myself. So what she did from that point was start really collating research, surveys, studies, assessments, case studies, all sorts of things. And over the course of a year, she compiled these into folders for me to read. And so the next Christmas, I came to visit her and she said to me, she's like, Jessica, I have created these folders for you. If you read these folders and after you read them, you do not think that you have FASD, I will never bring it up again. And if you read them, I will take you on a holiday.
Oh, right. Incentives. Wow.
Incentives,
Mhm.
bribery works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gratification works. Instant gratification. So I started reading these documents. I started reading the research and I started reading, and of course I've got good memories of what my child, the difficulties I went through in my childhood and where I struggled. And I started reading through the information and I got maybe an hour in and I burst, not even actually, and I burst into tears. And I was like, oh my God, this is me. This is, I don't even understand how this document could possibly be written because they don't know me. So how is it so accurate?
Mhm. Mhm.
And essentially, the journey started from there. And I would say that was Christmas 2016. And it
Mhm.
was from that point that we're seeking diagnosis. But that is not easy for an adult. And I know globally it's not easy for adults, but it's very, very difficult to obtain an adult diagnosis of FASD in Australia.
Yeah.
But we got there eventually,
Mhm.
4 years later.
Wow. So yeah, it's amazing. Your mother really was your advocate like through your entire life, just trying, being so concerned about you and just never giving up in terms of figuring out like what is wrong, like what is the issue and how can I help my child? And
Absolutely.
yeah, no, that's amazing that she the persistence, with that year in between to bring it up again and to approach it in that way and to help you find those answers, especially because I feel like, well, and I'm sure because you're an advocate, and one of the things that you do is help educate and help with regulations around FASD and support and education around that is that it's really not well understood. Like I think people maybe have an understanding of FAS, which is a very small subset of FASD, but in terms of the whole spectrum of FASD, I think there's a lot that people are still learning. And there are even some doctors, if you had even mentioned to them that, oh, my mother had alcohol while she was pregnant, I'm sure some doctors are like, well, that's fine. Like some alcohol's okay. Like it's kind of amazing how there's not like consistent understanding of the impact of alcohol during
It's
any point of pregnancy. Yeah.
it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking, and it was because of discovering FASD, learning about it, and then, of course, my diagnosis, and then realizing how it presents in individuals, the varying presentations in individuals, and then how little is known about it, how little awareness is about it, not only in community, in our communities, you know, parents planning a pregnancy, all of that, not just that, but health professionals and the whole gamut of health professionals who have really very, very little awareness and are to this day still telling women that they can drink in their pregnancy, regardless of low levels, regardless of what the sort of saying that low levels is okay, and it's only sort of high levels that are problematic, and that is not true.
Yeah.
I'm telling all your viewers right now,
Mhm.
that is fundamentally untrue. We have no known safe level. There is no level of alcohol that we know that hits our cells, that comes into our body and doesn't cause damage, particularly, of course, for a baby in utero.
Mhm.
My desire to really put FASD in the public consciousness is just because of how insidious
Mhm.
it actually is. And what I see is happening is we're getting this huge explosion of ADD and autism diagnosis in young adults and adult cohorts without any questions or assessments being done around alcohol exposure when these symptoms deeply overlap. And what's happening is that you're getting for many, many people, you're getting part of the diagnosis
Mhm.
with ADD, but you're not getting the whole picture look. And that's because the doctors and the specialists that you're seeing are not asking the questions, and they're not seeing that really that there needs to be sort of a whole neuropsych evaluation, and all the questions need to be asked there. And the reason that this is important is because causation is important, and we can't minimize and prevent if there's no accountability for the causation of why these difficulties are happening for, generations of people. But the other thing that I will say as to why a causation is very important is because autism and an autism diagnosis versus a FASD diagnosis, in where there are many, many sort of autistic symptoms or autistic traits, does require different interventions. The interventions are different. The way that the brain works is different. And so you will see similar symptoms, but the way that you handle those symptoms is different. And so it's always important to ask. And so when I discovered this and I realized that there were so many individuals such as myself that were struggling in this way, I had to speak about it.
Mhm. And so finally getting that diagnosis and understanding that you had FASD, how did that realization and the diagnosis change your life going forward from there?
Oh, wow. It's hard for me to put into words. Like, truly, it was like many things happened for me understanding the diagnosis, and coming to terms and embodying the fact and understanding the fact that, yes, I absolutely do have FASD. One I would say is that when this came about, when my mum intervened in my healthcare, I was in a very, very bad way, physically and emotionally, and she was scared for my safety, and she was scared for my life. It was a very dark time, and it was a difficult time for my family as well. So I was at this rock bottom point, and I had spent the last 30 years of my life internalizing every difficulty and experience and awkward interaction and failed exam and, all these sorts of difficulties, I even like managing my left and right and coordinating myself, for
Yeah.
example. All these things that I had experienced through my life, I had internalized. And it became, this is about me being defective. This is about me not working hard enough. I haven't done this. I'm not this. I'm not that. I'm not this. So, and that was very strong. That was very ingrained. And I had this battle of self-worth and self-esteem. So I was at a very low point. So, and I'd also been through the healthcare, and I'll just say this as well. I had been through the healthcare system regularly, and I had a, a lot of doctors and specialists that essentially reinforced that message that this was on me to change, that this was about me getting my head straight and trying harder and this and that, the other thing. And so it always came back on me. This is me. This is me. This is
Mhm.
me. And I need to do better and I'm a failure. So having the diagnosis and having a reason for there to be difficulties, not that, oh, Jessica, you're just dumb. Oh, Jessica, you're just lazy. Oh, Jessica, you just need to try harder, to have to go, no, that there are significant difficulties here and that with support, you can overcome them. It was like, this weight, this heaviness, this hurt, this was able to lift. It created an avenue. Diagnosis creates an avenue not only for support in Australia. I know it's different in the States and it's different in Canada, what you can access. And honestly, I was in Seattle earlier this year speaking at FASD United conference. And I have to say, I was deeply shocked with the lack of disability support that individuals can receive. Australia is better. We have lots of problems. That's probably a conversation for another time, Carolyn, but
Mhm.
there are lots of gaps and there are lots of issues. Don't get me wrong. It's not perfect, but what it allowed was access to support.
Yeah.
And and so for me, not only was it a weight off my very, very tired, very, very depressed shoulders,
Mhm.
and gave me a moment to sort of breathe and get a bit more understanding. It gave me hope for a different future. It gave me an opportunity to go, "Oh, hang on. I just didn't have the right tools. I'm not a failure. I just need a different approach. And and I just need a little bit of guidance in these areas of my life. And if I get that approach and if I can go from that view, from that lens and that approach, then things can improve. And it's been a journey, and I have a lot of ups and downs. I'm very symptomatic in a lot of ways. I still have meltdowns. I still get sensory overloaded. Like all those things still exist. But what the change is for me is one, I have more understanding and support around it from the outside world to a point. Again, another story for another time. And also from within my family unit, but I can give myself that understanding and support. And that opens you up for healing. And I was carrying a lot of stuff that really no one needs to be carrying,
Yeah.
and no one needs to be putting on themselves. So what it did was completely change my sense of self. It completely changed my perspective of who I was as a person and how I viewed the world. But not only that, but it changed my perspective on how I view other people. And I think that what it has also allowed is me to have not only more compassion for myself, but more compassion for other people, because now I can look through the brain-based lens, and I can go, when I interact with someone and maybe that interaction might be a bit funny, or there might be something that I don't quite understand, I can look at brain and I go, I can see that this is a brain-based behavior, or I can see that there might be something going on there. And I think it's given me more compassion and more perspective.
Yeah.
And it's allowed me to heal and use this understanding and this knowledge to put the right support in place to help manage these difficulties.
Yeah.
Completely changed my life.
Wow. And so, yeah, you mentioned that you can access supports that help you, and like what kinds of either disability supports or accommodations do you find most helpful for you in day-to-day life?
So a lot of people believe, because of my strong language skills, that somehow I'm, I guess, like, not very fast, or, but I do require, particularly to do the work that I'm doing at the moment, I do require quite a high level of support. So I work predominantly with a social worker. I work with an OT, an occupational therapist. I have I had a specialized physiotherapist for quite some time, although I've transferred that to a different sort of service. I have support work, so I have someone that just comes to my house and helps me with tasks that I might need to do, or just help me manage my schedule, because my schedule is quite busy, and that's very difficult to sort of navigate all the priorities and times when I have to do things and not double book myself and make sure I get, things done as I need to, and also keep my household together. And, as you well know, I'm sure, all the adulting things. So, yeah, so I would say predominantly my supports is a social worker, an occupational therapist, a support worker. I do have a coordinator that sort of coordinates my my people, like my team together, which is really nice. But I also need help, for example, with reminders to drink water. And I don't like to drink water. I have a lot of sensory things around it. I don't like to
Mhm.
swallow it. I don't like the taste of it. I don't like the texture of it. So I do have, even at 38 years old, I do have someone that helps me make sure that I'm getting hydrated and feeding myself, taking medication. I have support for all of that. I don't actually manage it that well. I know that I need to do it,
Mhm.
but so the knowledge is there, but the ability to manage and do it all
Mhm.
is a whole different
Yeah.
kettle of fish. I do also get help with food prep and food service because of that. And then I do have different sort of sensory help as
Mhm.
well. So, for example, I have things like a weighted blanket, and I use aromatherapy, and I have sort of sensory items that help me wind down. So, yeah, I have quite a number of supports to allow me to function to the capacity that I'm functioning at. And I promise you that before I had that support, I was not functioning this way.
Mhm.
It's a completely different world.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's so many things that can
Mhm.
potentially be helpful for people, and that's great that you are able to access and use a lot of those, and that they really do help you in your day to day. Wow.
It's completely changed my world, and the reason that I speak about this, and I like to speak to the power of diagnosis, and I like to speak to the power of support, even if our governments are not, in your country, the governments are not supporting, but having that knowledge in your circle, in your community, within your family unit it can be hugely beneficial.
Yeah.
I know that there are lots of different situations why, and it's important for individuals to understand that there are many, many, many reasons why a baby may be exposed to alcohol in utero, and every sort of family history is different. But what I will say is that predominantly we have a large cohort of individuals that live with FASD because there was late pregnancy recognition in the sense that the mother and father didn't know that the woman was pregnant. That just she didn't know. And then when she did know, and this is the case in my family, in the case with my mother's pregnancy with me, as soon as she found out that she was pregnant with me, she stopped drinking. But, she didn't know she was pregnant for the first several weeks.
Mhm.
And that's all it takes. That's really all it takes. And having, and I want women to have that awareness. I want women to know that even in low levels, this does cause damage. And we have to be really mindful of contraception.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point because I think part of the, unfortunately, stigma and shame that surrounds FASD so often is around, you know, thinking poorly about the mother or the parent who drank and how could you do that? It's like, well, understand that people don't know they're pregnant like the second they get pregnant. And as you said, that's all it takes is to, really you stop as soon as you know, but sometimes, the impact has already been had. So yeah, it's an important point.
Absolutely. And it's so and so a lot of, and I've been part of this wonderful campaign that Australia launched in, I think it was November 2021,
Mhm.
and it's called the Every Moment Matters campaign. It's the largest like a alcohol and pregnancy awareness campaign that we've ever done in Australia, and it's been hugely successful. The reason it's called Every Moment Matters is to express to people that from the point of conception, you must not have alcohol in your system. And so it's like, if you're planning or trying for a pregnancy or feel like you may become pregnant, stop. Stop before you're pregnant. And now this is can be a very helpful piece of information and message and sort of awareness for individuals who, it might just be socially or casually drinking. We do need different services and different understanding for women who might be suffering or struggling with alcohol use disorder. That needs a supportive wraparound service to help make sure that women that might be struggling with those sorts of misuse disorders are protected as much as they can and are supported as much as they can to have the healthiest and safest pregnancy, not only for the baby, but for themselves as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Mhm.
But what we do see is a huge amount of stigma. And I speak about low and moderate levels and the like the prevalence of late pregnancy recognition because it tends to be othered. There's always this othering, that it happens to other women, that it happens to other children, and it happens in certain community groups and stuff. And that none of that is true. Not only is it anecdotally untrue, but it's statistically untrue as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really important point for people to realize that, it really can affect almost anyone who
Anyone.
consumes alcohol at any point in time. So, yeah. Yeah.
Wherever alcohol is consumed, FASD exists. It does. But with awareness, with education, with understanding, we can minimize it.
Well, Jessica, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story and educating us all more about FASD and the impacts and a general education about it. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your advocacy?
So I think a good way to see things that I do is, of course, jumping on the socials. So I do have a Twitter and an Instagram page. I have to admit that I can be a little bit on and off on my socials, but I am working on it. I'm working on a bit more of a regular online presence. But if you have a look at JB Talks FASD, that's a surefire way to find me. Anyone who would like to speak with me or learn a little bit more about what I've been doing and my advocacy, please feel free to email me at jessicabirch.fasd@gmail.com. I'm currently also just finalizing my website, and I'm pretty sure that it's www.jbtalksfasd.com.au. And absolutely, I'm always open to questions and suggestions of what you might like to hear from me on socials. And please give me a follow. It really makes me happy. It does support the work that I've been doing. And yeah,
Great. That's fantastic. I'll put those links in the show notes so that people can click on them when they're listening to this episode and follow you from there. As we close out, is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know or anything they can help or support you with?
I guess I'd like listeners to understand that there is a lot of overlap of symptoms between other neuro sort of divergent diagnoses. And it's always important to ask the questions, not only for an individual that you might be caring for or your child, but for yourself as an individual to get a full picture. So it can be very difficult. I'm not saying that these are not difficult questions to be asked, but I strongly recommend that having a full picture allows for the right things to be put in place for you in your life, and it allows for better understanding of what you might be experiencing. So I definitely will say that. The other thing, what would I like? What would I like other things for listeners to know? I guess that the stigma is real. It's always important to ask the question, but it's also always important that when you meet someone that might be struggling a little bit in a conversation, or seems like they need a little bit of extra help, to just it might be something else that you can't see, and that just to hold compassion for people. We don't know what their experience is.
Yeah. Well, it's really important to remember. So, yeah. Thanks again, Jessica, for sharing your story. I really enjoyed meeting you and talking with you today. So, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn. It was a pleasure.